Aisha Sharma and Jason Miller seemed like the perfect couple, an Indian bride and her Canadian groom bound by love, culture, and promise. But within days of their fairy-tale wedding, her secret turned their dream into a nightmare and his family's love into lethal rage. Aisha Sharma grew up in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Delhi, where dreams often felt bigger than the walls of the homes people lived in. Her father was a retired government clerk, and her mother ran a small tailoring shop from their balcony. They weren't poor, but life was predictable, unchanging, and full of quiet sacrifices. Aisha, at 27, had reached an age where relatives whispered about her late marriage, and every family gathering came with the same uncomfortable question: when will it be your turn? She had always wanted something more than the life she saw around her. She admired women who spoke fluent English, who posted photos from foreign cities, who seemed to have escaped the limits of small-town expectations. When she created a profile on a matrimonial website, she wasn't just looking for a husband. She was searching for a way out, a new beginning. Then came Jason Miller. His message appeared one evening while she was helping her mother sew a wedding dress for a client. His words were polite, almost formal. He introduced himself as a software engineer from Toronto, Canada, working for a major tech firm. He was 30, never married, and said he admired Indian traditions. At first, Aisha thought it was just another casual match request, but unlike others, Jason kept writing. He asked about her hobbies, her family, and what she dreamed of doing in life. He told her he wanted a marriage built on respect and understanding, not just convenience. Over time, their exchanges grew frequent and emotional. He sent her photos of snow-covered streets, of his dog playing in the backyard, of sunsets over Lake Ontario. She shared pictures of her family, her favorite temple, and the meals she cooked. Their lives were separated by continents, yet they began to feel strangely close. When Jason said he wanted to meet in person, Aisha could hardly believe it. Within a month, he and his parents had booked flights to India. The Millers arrived in Delhi during winter, and their first meeting with Aisha's family was full of charm and warmth. Jason's mother, Susan, hugged Aisha and complimented her cooking. His father, Mark, spoke about how much he respected Indian culture and traditions. They seemed kind, open-minded, and genuinely accepting. For Aisha's parents, it felt like a blessing. A family from abroad, financially stable and respectful, wanting their daughter as a daughter-in-law. It was everything they had hoped for. Her father, who had spent years saving for her wedding, felt his efforts had finally paid off. Her mother prayed each night, thanking God for sending Jason into Aisha's life. The wedding was planned quickly, with both families agreeing on a traditional ceremony at a luxury hotel in Delhi. The atmosphere was filled with excitement and pride. The rituals began early in the morning, the sound of temple bells echoing through the hall. Aisha looked radiant in a red silk sari embroidered with gold, her hands decorated with henna patterns spelling out Jason's name. Guests took pictures, children danced, and Jason's family appeared delighted by the colorful celebration. But beneath the glitter and laughter, there was a quiet nervousness in Aisha's heart. She had told no one about her past medical condition, a secret she kept locked deep inside. She convinced herself it wouldn't matter. The doctors had said she was healthy, her condition was under control, and love, real love, would overcome everything. Still, as she looked at Jason placing a garland around her neck, a faint tremor passed through her hands. That night, after the ceremonies ended, Aisha stood by the window of her hotel room, watching the city lights fade into the horizon. The air smelled of jasmine and fireworks. She imagined her new life in Canada, a cozy home, a loving husband, a fresh start far from the gossip of relatives and the narrowness of her world. She believed she was stepping into the life she had always dreamed of. What she didn't know was that the warmth she saw in Jason's family would soon disappear. The same smiles that had welcomed her in India would turn cold and judgmental once she crossed oceans. The grand wedding that had promised her freedom would become the first step toward her destruction. And as she drifted to sleep that night, her future already began to change in ways she could never have imagined. When Aisha arrived in Canada, the winter air struck her face like a wave of cold reality. Snowflakes floated across the gray sky as she stepped out of the airport, clutching her passport and a small handbag. Jason walked ahead, focused on his phone, barely glancing back to see if she was keeping up. She told herself it was just fatigue from the long flight. The excitement she had carried from India began to fade into a quiet unease. The Miller house looked like something out of a magazine. A two-story suburban home with clean white walls, a wide porch, and a small maple tree in the yard. Inside, everything smelled of pine wood and disinfectant. Family portraits hung neatly on the walls. Jason as a child, family trips, Christmas gatherings. It was warm, beautiful, but strangely lifeless. Susan Miller welcomed her with a polite smile, but her eyes held something else, a sharpness, a cold evaluation. She showed Aisha her room and mentioned, almost casually, that it used to be a guest room. Jason's father, Mark, nodded stiffly and disappeared into his study without much conversation. Aisha noticed the way they looked at her sari, her accent, even the way she folded her hands in greeting. She tried to brush it off, convincing herself that cultural differences took time. Over the next few days, she tried to settle in. She cooked Indian dishes for the family, cleaned the kitchen, and arranged small gifts she had brought from Delhi. Jason, however, became distant. He spent long hours at work, rarely ate dinner with her, and when he did, he spoke only in short replies. Aisha thought it was because his parents were around, or maybe he needed time to adjust to married life. She tried not to complain, but the tension grew thicker each day. Susan began to correct her constantly, how she spoke, how she dressed, how much salt she added to the food. She made sharp comments disguised as advice, and Mark barely acknowledged her presence. Aisha felt trapped between politeness and rejection. She would stand by the window at night, staring at the snow-covered street, missing the noise and warmth of Delhi. One morning, Susan knocked on her door holding an envelope. It was addressed to Aisha from a clinic in India. The handwriting was familiar, her old doctor. Aisha froze, realizing she had forgotten to remove that paper from her luggage. Susan's voice was calm, but her words carried accusation. She asked what kind of treatment Aisha had been receiving and why she had hospital documents hidden in her bag. Aisha stammered, saying it was just a general health checkup, nothing important. Susan's expression didn't change, but her eyes darkened with suspicion. Later that evening, Aisha overheard Jason and his mother talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but the tension was clear. The next few days, Susan became unusually quiet, watching Aisha closely. Jason too avoided her gaze. The warmth she had once felt in his messages was completely gone. It was as if the entire house had turned against her. A week after her arrival, Jason told her that his mother wanted her to visit a nearby clinic for an immigration medical checkup. Aisha didn't question it. She thought it was a standard procedure, something all immigrants went through. When she returned from the clinic, Susan asked her to rest, offering tea with a smile that felt forced. Aisha sensed something brewing, but couldn't quite name it. That night, while lying awake, she noticed Jason's parents whispering in the hallway. Their voices carried anger, fear, and disgust. She heard her name mentioned again and again, followed by the words "test results," and "lied to us." Her heart raced. She wanted to ask what was happening, but couldn't find the courage. She told herself it was probably a misunderstanding, that everything would be fine once Jason explained things to them. But deep down she knew something terrible had been uncovered. The calm before the storm had arrived, and the family's silence was far more terrifying than their words could ever be. The morning after the clinic visit, the atmosphere in the Miller house changed completely. Aisha woke to the sound of whispers downstairs. She could sense tension before she even stepped out of her room. Jason sat at the dining table, his hands clasped tightly, his face pale. Susan and Mark stood nearby, their expressions unreadable but heavy with anger. A folded document lay on the table between them, the clinic's logo clearly visible. Aisha's heart began to pound as she walked closer. No one greeted her. Jason didn't look up. Susan picked up the paper, her voice shaking as she said the words that froze Aisha's world. "You're HIV positive." The room went silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Aisha felt her knees weaken. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She wanted to speak, to explain, but her throat felt dry, her words trapped in fear and shame. She tried to tell them that she hadn't lied out of malice, that her condition was under control, that she was on medication, and her doctors had said she could live a completely normal life. She explained that she had contracted the virus a year earlier through a blood transfusion after a car accident. She hadn't told anyone because she was terrified of being rejected, but her words didn't matter. The faces in front of her were filled with disgust, not understanding. Susan's shock quickly turned to rage. She accused Aisha of ruining her son's life, of deceiving their family for money and citizenship. Mark called her a liar, saying she had trapped Jason into marriage. Jason remained silent, his face pale, eyes cold and distant. The man who had once written her long, affectionate messages now looked at her as if she were a stranger. The accusations came one after another. Susan shouted that Aisha's family must have known and hidden the truth. Mark demanded to know how many people she had infected. Aisha tried to defend herself, saying that her viral load was undetectable, that she posed no risk to anyone, but they didn't believe a word. In their minds, she was dangerous, deceitful, and unclean. The humiliation crushed her. She fell to her knees, begging them to understand that she had only wanted love, not pity. But the more she pleaded, the more furious they became. Jason finally stood up, his voice trembling as he asked her if it was true that she had hidden her diagnosis from him. She nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. He stared at her for a long time, then turned away, muttering that she had destroyed everything. After that confrontation, the household became unbearably silent. No one spoke to Aisha, meals were taken separately, Jason slept in another room. Susan disinfected every surface Aisha touched, refusing to let her use the family dishes. Mark avoided her completely, spending his evenings in his study with the door locked. Aisha spent her days sitting by the window, watching the snow fall, wondering how quickly love could turn into hatred. She thought about calling her parents in India, but she couldn't bear to tell them what had happened. She had promised them happiness, a better life, a future full of respect. How could she now admit that her marriage was already collapsing, that she had become a prisoner in her new home? Each day felt longer than the last. The house was cold, not just from the winter outside, but from the silence that filled every room. At night, she could hear Susan crying behind closed doors and Jason arguing with his father. Sometimes the words deported and fraud drifted through the air. Aisha tried to pack her things once, thinking of leaving quietly, but Jason stopped her. His expression was distant, his voice hollow. He said his parents needed time to process everything. She could tell it wasn't concern for her. It was about reputation, about hiding the shame from neighbors and relatives back in Canada. Days later, Susan called Aisha into the living room. The kindness was gone from her voice. She told Aisha that people like her had no place in their family, that she had brought disgrace under their roof. Aisha stood there, trembling, clutching the hem of her sweater, unable to reply. That night, she cried silently, realizing she had nowhere left to go. The secret she had buried to protect her future had become the very reason she was being destroyed. What she had hoped would stay hidden forever was now the weapon being used to break her down, piece by piece. The evening began with a heavy stillness, the kind that settles over a house before a storm. Aisha sat alone in her room, staring at the faint reflection of herself in the dark window. Her face looked unfamiliar, tired, pale, and hollow. She hadn't slept in days. The Miller house, once filled with polite smiles and polite conversation, now felt like a trap. Every corner carried whispers of resentment. Every sound made her flinch. She had stopped eating with the family. Meals were left outside her door, untouched. She wasn't allowed to cook any more because Susan said it made her uncomfortable. Jason had become a stranger. He barely spoke and refused to meet her eyes. The few times they crossed paths in the hallway, he moved aside as if afraid to be near her. The silence between them was worse than shouting. It was as if their entire marriage had been erased in a matter of days. That night, Jason came home late. The snow was falling heavily outside, covering the streets in white silence. Aisha heard the sound of the front door slamming and hushed voices downstairs. She couldn't make out every word, but her name came up again and again, followed by sharp tones of anger. She pressed her ear to the door and caught fragments of the argument, Susan accusing her of lying, Mark demanding that Jason fix the situation, before it became public. Then footsteps began climbing the stairs. Aisha stepped back, her heart racing. The door swung open. Jason stood there, his face pale but his eyes burning with something she had never seen before. Shame, fury, and confusion all tangled together. Behind him, Susan appeared, clutching a folded paper in her hand. She said nothing at first, only stared at Aisha as though she were something filthy that had invaded her home. The confrontation began quietly but grew like a fire. Susan accused Aisha of deceiving the entire family, of putting her son's life in danger. She said their friends had started asking questions about why Jason's wife wasn't seen in public. Aisha tried to explain again, her voice shaking, saying she was healthy, that her treatment made her non-infectious, that there was no danger to anyone. But her words meant nothing to them anymore. Mark entered the room, his voice booming. He shouted that she had shamed them, that she was a fraud who had used their kindness to escape poverty. Jason, standing between them, looked broken. When Aisha tried to move closer to him, he pushed her away. That single gesture shattered her completely. The argument escalated. Objects were thrown, voices rose, and the calm suburban house turned into a place of chaos. Aisha begged them to stop, to listen, but her cries only fueled their rage. Susan's voice grew louder, full of hysteria, saying she had brought disease into their home. Mark's anger boiled over, and he grabbed a nearby lamp, slamming it to the floor. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. Then came the violence. It was sudden and brutal. Aisha tried to run, but Mark grabbed her arm, dragging her back. Jason shouted for him to stop, but did nothing to intervene. Susan slapped Aisha hard across the face, her fury spilling out in every motion. Aisha fell, hitting her head against the edge of a table. Pain shot through her, but she didn't scream. She tried to crawl away, only for someone to pull her back again. What followed was chaos, blows, shouts, and the sound of something heavy breaking. When the noise finally stopped, the room was in ruins. Aisha lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling near her hairline. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes half open, fixed on the ceiling. The family stood frozen, the weight of what had just happened settling like a shadow over them. Jason knelt beside her, whispering her name, but she didn't move. Hours passed before they decided what to do. Panic replaced anger. They wrapped her body in a bedsheet and placed her on the guest room bed. Susan insisted they tell the police it had been an accident, that she had slipped during an argument. Jason said nothing. He just stared at his hands, trembling, the reality of what they had done slowly breaking through the fog of fear. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the house in white silence. To the neighbors, the miller's home looked peaceful as ever. But inside, behind those clean suburban walls, a young bride's life had ended, not by a stranger's hand, but by the very family she had trusted to love her. Morning arrived quietly, with the sound of sirens cutting through the snowy streets. The neighbors had called the police after hearing screams and loud noises during the night. When officers knocked on the miller's door, Susan greeted them with trembling hands and a carefully rehearsed story. She said there had been an accident, that her daughter-in-law had fallen during an argument. Her voice shook just enough to sound convincing. Jason stood behind her, pale and silent, his eyes avoiding everyone's gaze. The officers entered the house and immediately sensed that something was wrong. The air felt heavy, like guilt had settled into the walls. They followed Susan upstairs, where Aisha's body lay on the bed wrapped in a white bedsheet. There were dark bruises along her arms, a gash on her forehead, and traces of blood on the carpet. One officer lifted the edge of the sheet and exchanged a quick, grim look with his partner. This was no fall. Jason was taken aside for questioning, while forensic investigators moved through the house. They collected broken pieces of furniture, strands of hair, and blood samples. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering as police cars filled the driveway. One woman told the officers she had heard terrible shouting and something that sounded like a fight. Another said she had seen Jason's parents arguing with him earlier that week. The autopsy confirmed what the investigators already suspected. Aisha had died from blunt, force trauma with multiple fractures and internal bleeding. There were defensive wounds on her hands, showing that she had tried to protect herself. The timeline of injuries made it clear that the attack had lasted for hours. The medical examiner called it one of the most brutal domestic cases he had seen in years. When Jason was brought in for formal questioning, his facade began to crumble. He admitted there had been an argument, but insisted it had gotten out of control. He said his parents had panicked when they found out about Aisha's HIV diagnosis and that they had lost their minds. He tried to paint the violence as an accident, but the evidence told a different story. The bruises, the broken lamp, the bloodstains, all pointed to deliberate, prolonged assault. The story spread quickly through Canadian and Indian media. Headlines described Aisha as asterisk, the Indian bride murdered on her wedding night. Asterisk, the case sparked debates about prejudice, stigma, and how ignorance could still destroy lives in modern society. Activists spoke out about discrimination against people with HIV, while others condemned the cruelty of the Miller family. Jason's once respectable image vanished overnight. His company suspended him, and his friends distanced themselves. During the trial, prosecutors presented a chilling picture of the events leading to Aisha's death. They showed photographs of the crime scene and read excerpts from her medical records, proving she had been on treatment and posed no risk to anyone. The defense tried to argue temporary insanity, claiming the family's reaction was driven by fear and shock, but the jury was unmoved. The evidence of brutality was overwhelming. Susan and Mark Miller were convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Jason received a 10-year sentence for manslaughter after claiming he hadn't participated in the assault but had failed to stop it. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. Susan wept loudly. Mark stared straight ahead without expression. Jason simply lowered his head, knowing that no punishment could erase what had been done. Aisha's remains were sent back to India. Her parents received them in a simple wooden casket, accompanied by official documents and an apology from the Canadian government. There were no reporters at the cremation, no crowds, no speeches. Her father stood by the pyre with a blank face, holding her photograph in his trembling hands. Her mother didn't speak at all. She only whispered her daughter's name as the flames rose. Months later, a small documentary team visited Delhi to film her story. They spoke to her old friends, her neighbors, and her doctor, who all described her as kind, hopeful, and full of life. The doctor confirmed she had been on medication, completely healthy, and ready to start a family someday. The tragedy, he said, was not the disease, but the fear that surrounded it. Years passed, and the case remained a haunting reminder of how secrets, stigma, and ignorance could destroy even the purest of dreams. In Canada, the Miller house was eventually sold, its walls repainted, its rooms emptied of the horror they once held. But among the whispers of the neighborhood, people still remembered the Indian bride who had come seeking love and found death instead. In India, Aisha's story became a quiet symbol of truth buried under shame. Some say her spirit still lingers in the dreams of those who hear her story, reminding them that fear can kill faster than any illness, and that silence, more than violence, is what truly ends a life.